Good? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about power analysis today. I'm taking a slightly different approach than I normally do because I'm going to be focusing instead on preserving the power of power analyses, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So back in 2006, which is when I finished school and when it's about around when I developed the power analysis tool that I have, my attitude when I would sit down and help somebody with their grant was I had to do a power analysis for everything because that's how I did my job previously when I worked for pulmonary surgeons, but it's a very different thing than with fMRI data, which is typically what I'm working with. But now in 2017, I'm a little more skeptical about what I can and cannot compute power for. And frequently, when I sit down with a draft of somebody's grant application and I'm making my plans for the power analysis, there are definitely things that I encounter and I'm like, we're just not going to be able to compute power for that. You can always make up numbers, right? But that goes back to the title. I want to preserve the power of the power analysis. It should be more than just having a blurb that you're throwing into your grant application. But then that got me thinking about, what happens when these grants are being reviewed? So I've seen things like this. This is from a different, this is a real life example, but it's from my friend who does genetics work. And she was brought in on a grant during the revision process. So she didn't run the initial power analysis, but her data are a lot like our data. They're very noisy. Huge multiple comparison problem. Yet there was this power analysis that was like, we've got 90% power to run this super complicated model with our sample of 30 subjects. And she's like, oh, this is the first thing I need to fix in this grant application. This is a really inaccurate power calculation. But then she looked at the reviewer comments, and the reviewers were so excited about the power analysis section. They're like, nice job. That is a great power analysis section. So she was kind of backed into a corner. And it's not that it probably was a realistic power analysis, but probably not just for, in this case, genetics data or for our imaging data, which are really noisy and we have very small effects that we're after. So I was thinking, well, how does that compare to the power analysis sections that I tend to write, which are, I'm a little glass half empty when I do it, and I often have things like, we have 70% power. We're going to use this really simple model because simpler models are easier to compute power or to power, with a nice sample of 80 subjects. 80 subjects is a respectable sample size for an fMRI study, for example. And I don't know this for certain, but I feel like maybe there's less excitement from the reviewers. And I could be wrong. You can correct me later. But I kind of wonder if this type of power analysis is less exciting. What? I've seen it happen, so unfortunately. Get it at 70%? Sure. It's honest. The question was if I've seen things get funded if the power was quoted at 70%, and I have. Part of my paycheck, part of my salary is paid off of one of those grants. It was not AIM 1, obviously, but yeah. My other thought is perhaps people just look for the word power, and they check the box. Yep, they did a power analysis. So, yeah. So I've never been on a committee for this. The grant reviews I've done didn't need power analyses. But I do serve on a scientific review board, but with a group of statisticians. And we actually do look at power, and we take a close look at it. So my concern is that power analyses are going to start to be, as we're doing them, we're more and more frequently putting effort into including power analyses, and they're expected a lot more now than they were back in 2006 when I started doing this. My concern is that people are going to start thinking power analyses are nonsense because a lot of them can be kind of nonsensical. Again, not necessarily maliciously. It's just it's very difficult with our data to know what effect sizes to expect. But when you run a power analysis, you get a lot more out of it than just that blurb about power that goes into your grant. And this is what I notice when I'm reviewing study protocols with the statisticians. Typically, the people who have decent power analysis sections have decent everything related to statistics, because you can tell that they sat down and really thought through their model and their hypotheses. So when running a power analysis, you typically have to think through your hypotheses a lot more clearly. You have to convert these words, these ideas that you have, into a very specific statistical model, and you have to think about how you're going to be modeling your data in the future. And often in that process, when I sit down with, in my case, typically psychologists, and we work this out, the aim changes a little bit. It's like, oh, we're not going to be able to do that. Let's do this instead. That'll give us a little more power. And also, if I'm trying to find effect sizes, or if I have enough time and I can ask somebody for their data to run the power analysis, or find some data online to get effect sizes, in the process, you're revisiting the literature, and oftentimes you'll, when you're rereading it, realize, oh, they didn't do exactly what I thought they did, which goes back to this idea of transparently reporting what you've done. And that can change your ideas or your thoughts about what you're setting out to do. And of course, it's a good excuse to touch base with a statistician. Just make sure, if you're working with a statistician who doesn't typically work with imaging data, that they're aware how small our effects typically are. And sometimes it can help you prepare for the worst, which definitely for some people I work with that do clinical work, there's not much they can do to increase their sample sizes, and I'm fully aware of that. So we do everything else that we can to get the most power out of the sample that they can, that they have. For example, efficiency searches for their fMRI design. So there's a lot more to a power analysis than just that power blurb. So what I want to give today, what I want to share, are some ideas to help you if you're assessing a grant or something with somebody's power analysis in it, because I feel like you all are more likely to be in that situation than I will be. I don't know how frequently statisticians are on those committees. And it'll help you in designing your power analyses. So the first question, the hardest question, is if the power analysis seems realistic. And the hardest part about that is you have to know what the effect size is. Nobody knows the effect size. When I worked with pulmonary surgeons, I could easily say, well, what's the worst decrease in quality of life that you would hate to miss? And they could give me a number. And we can't really do that with, fMRI with bold activation, because we don't know what the range of that number is, or even how to define it sometimes. Also, you can look at how complex the model is. Are they doing something simple, like a one-sample t-test that's really easy to power? Or are they doing something really complicated, like a multivariate model or a structural equation model? Those things have a lot of parameters to estimate. And the more parameters there are in a model, the harder it is to power it. And how much thought does it seem like went into the power analysis? How long did they sit down and think it through? So the aims need to be really clear. And the statistical models need to actually answer the questions proposed in the aims. And I see that mismatch a lot when I'm reviewing study protocols. They'll have this really complicated idea, and then they'll just say, we're going to run t-tests. It's like, well, what kind of t-test does that? And last but not least, and I've been guilty of this, is having a mismatch between the power analysis that was carried out and the statistical analysis that was proposed. So sometimes that happens if the grant gets last-minute revisions. So you want to make sure those things all match in the description. So I'm going to start by talking about effect size. If they have a very specific effect size, or if you're going to use a specific effect size, there's really only one situation that's okay, and that's if, and we're talking about circular analyses a little bit in the last talk, if you have an unbiased ROI that was used and the analysis got the effect size from that, and basically also you have to worry about publication bias still occurring. But that's the most okay way to get an effect size. When What's not okay, unfortunately, is probably most published effect sizes. There's still a lot of circular analyses that occur. I'm not against looking at your data and the ROI. I am against publishing the slope or the mean or whatever, because I think that's misleading. So you do have to look out for numbers that are based on circular analyses. And then there's also the file drawer problem. You're not seeing all of the effect sizes. You're only seeing the ones that were statistically significant. If you had all of them and you averaged them, you would have a much smaller number. So unfortunately, we have this problem where effect sizes, we can't use this, well, what would I hate to miss approach that I could use before, and we can't use well, what's there necessarily, if depending on how it was published. Of course, you can use databases, that then you have to still make sure you're not doing something that's circular, because once you've seen the results in any way, shape, or form, and then you construct an ROI to use with it, you have to make sure you're not being biased in that way. There's also this idea of small, medium, and large effects. I'm not a huge fan of these categories. From what I understand, most statisticians aren't, but I can say that for most fMRI experiments at least, small is probably pretty big. So you can at least use that as a rough guideline. And I know there are exceptions to the rule, because I've said this before on Twitter, and then I was told that somebody did have very big effect sizes, and so I'm sure it's possible. I know certain vision experiments, you can really crank up the bold response. But for most of the studies I've worked with, they're very tiny. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through models and these small, medium, and large effects and look at power, just to build a little bit of intuition about what you would expect to see in data. So what is the absolute simplest model you can run at the group level? Just shout it out. Yep, group average, a one sample t-test. It's also typically the easiest to power. Technically, it's often a paired t-test, because you're looking at paired differences between two task activations in fMRI, but they're typically the easiest ones to power. So these are the power curves for one sample t-test. For small, I think these are close to the Cohen's cutoffs for small, medium, and large effects. So this is the mean and standard deviation units. And you can see for the smallest effect size of 0.2, even with 250 subjects, you're barely at 80% power. Luckily for this type of test, we do often see things that are probably closer to this medium effect size, around 0.5, and that has 80% power, closer to 40 subjects. So again, it depends on the study, and hopefully you're a little bit familiar with the types of effects that this task would elicit, but if it's somewhere between medium and small, they're going to need upwards of, somewhere between 40 to 100 or more subjects just for a one sample t-test. What if I take it up a notch? What's the next most difficult model? Two sample t-test. Right, so now this is the sample size per group and power. Same effect sizes, but now these are mean differences of 0.2, 0.5, and 0.7. And in this case, things are even worse for the small effect. You have to have at least, even with 250 subjects per group, you're not even close to 80% power. For the medium effect, if you have around about 70 to 80 subjects per group, things are looking a little better. And this is just a plain old two sample t-test. Often, the folks I work with, at least, are interested in correlations. So I typically, within the range of these three tests, I typically aim to power a correlation. For one, we have a little bit better intuition, I think, of what those effect sizes look like. I would say 0.3 is pretty big for a correlation between bold activation and behavior. So that's typically what I aim for, is 0.3, 0.2. Of course, that can vary too. And you can see that for that effect size of a correlation of 0.3, you need close to 100 subjects to have 80% power. So for me personally, I typically aim, and I get laughed at a lot, but I'm like, could we please have 100 subjects per group? and I very rarely get it, but I'm going to ask. And sometimes you do get it. I know someone, she has a R21, 100 subjects per group. It was the most magically planned study ever. So anyway, that gives you an idea, though, how limited you are with the imaging data. A sample size of 30, the power is going to be very low, and it's not likely that those results are going to replicate if the study were repeated. So recently, one of the power analyses I sort of decided not to do was for an interaction effect, for a group interaction between group and some continuous variable. So basically, testing the difference in slopes of these two lines, where, again, bold activation versus behavior. How many of you have heard of G-Power? Yeah, it's a great piece of software, PC, Mac, it's available. So has this graphical user interface. It's a little hard to see. They have the option here for a t-test for testing the difference between two slopes. It's a little hard for me to see, but hopefully you can see. I'm guessing from memory. I think this is the difference in slopes. Okay. So that's one thing you have to specify. And then we get a couple of easy ones. Is this a type 1 error next? We have type 1 error and power. I'm just going to say the things, and they might be out of order. You have type 1 error and power. We typically set type 1 error at 0.05. I almost always do ROI-based power analyses. So if I had 10 ROIs, I would use just a Bonferroni correction, 0.05 divided by 10. Power we typically set at 0.8. And then there are, I believe, a couple of variance terms, maybe 3 variance terms, and the ratio of the sample sizes between the two groups, N2 over N1, which it seems reasonable that you would have those balanced. If not, you can change it. And you can hit the calculate button. I think these were the defaults. And in this case, it'll spit out the sample sizes you need per group, and they're huge. I think it's 345. So that's not going to happen. If I'm not going to get 100, probably not going to get 345. What's interesting about this tool, and I've run into this when someone told me that they've run a power calculation using it, and I was like, oh, that model has a lot of parameters. How did you set the parameters? So they're like, I went with the defaults. I'm like, well, we can't do that. And then I looked at it for the model. That model was actually a multivariate model. I don't see that option in the GUI anymore, or maybe I missed it. And the thing is, if you click this little button over here, this determine button, it opens a little drawer, and that's where it hides how many parameters actually went into the calculation. It's not a lot more in this case. For each group, you have 3 parameters. You have, I think it's a correlation, a variance, and a slope. And then from that, and then the sample size ratio. And from that, it estimates the rest of the parameters that you need. So there are 6 parameters that have to be set. In comparison, the previous 3 power analyses we looked at had 1 parameter, the correlation or the Cohen's d. It's a lot easier to make a good guess at 1 parameter than it is for these 6 parameters. If you had great pilot data, you could definitely do it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but if you're reading a grant application and they're like, oh, the power for this would be, whatever, they need to report where they got these parameter estimates from. And so a good use of this tool, G-Power, not only to run power analyses, but if you're evaluating somebody else's power analysis and you want to know how many parameters they had to estimate, you can just look and see how many fields there are. Just don't forget to click the determine button so the magic drawer pops open. Okay, so in terms of powering interactions, it's not impossible for the grant I was recently working on. We didn't have pilot data. I wasn't comfortable making up those numbers. I tried a couple of different ways of doing it, trying to reduce the parameters. I was like, you know what, this is ridiculous. I'm just not going to be able to do it. So in that scenario, the best I can do is say, you know what, I did get 100 subjects per group in that case. I'm like, well, we have 100 subjects per group, so we can at least power the individual group correlations, which are tested against 0, right? But the group difference I couldn't power. And I just left it at that. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm not, oh, actually, no, I think it did fine. I think I know what happened, and it did okay. But again, they might have just said power analysis section, check. But what else did I want to say? I just wanted to point out if a correlation of 0.3 is about what you would hope to see, then the correlation differences are probably going to be really small, especially compared to that 0.3. So interaction effects are hard to power. So the quick reality checks is first you can just say, is this more complicated than a 2-sample t-test or a correlation? If it is, then you can just say, well, is their power analysis more promising than what I would have seen for the 1-sample t-test or a 2-sample t-test or a correlation analysis? And you can use that as a rough guesstimate at whether or not that power analysis makes sense. And then, as I said, you can check out G-power and see how many parameters had to go into that power analysis. So if you see something like structural equation model power analyses or multivariate model power analyses, those models have a ton of parameters. It's really hard to get good estimates of those for a power analysis for imaging data in most cases. Just don't forget to look at that determine drawer and always ask where the parameters came from. And it said earlier, make sure the hypotheses and the aims match the models that were proposed and the models of the power analysis. And the specific models to be used need to be pretty clear. And by now you're probably thinking, wow, the statistical section of the grant is 3 pages long, but you can do this pretty concisely and still get all the information across. Oh, and a thing I really hate is when someone's like, well, they did a study with 40 subjects and found results, so we only need 40 subjects. That's not a power analysis. That's kind of nothing. That could have been a false positive, or they could have just been lucky, so you don't want to base it on that. Last, and I could talk about this for a whole hour, post hoc power doesn't make sense. So this I'm noticing more pressure because some journals are requiring power analyses when you submit a paper. And you may have not done one. And power analyses by nature should be done prior to the analysis. And I'm sure there's some SPSS users in here. I know SPSS spits out, what do they call it, observed power or something like that. And the idea is that it's telling you the power of the result you just found. But post-hoc power, unfortunately, we can't do that. And if you didn't run a power analysis before you carried out your study, you're not going to have a power analysis for that paper submission. I forget which journals now require it. So you're going to have to do something else. And the reason it doesn't make sense because the definition of power is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis given the alternative is true. So let's just look at the beginning of that statement, the probability of rejecting the null. Well, if you just ran your hypothesis test, that probability is 0 or 1, right? You either did reject the null, so 1, or you didn't, 0. So, of course, we don't know if the alternative is true or not, but it's just there are different ways of looking at it to show that post hoc power doesn't make sense, but I think that's the simplest one. It's a probability. It's referring to a bunch of tests, not just a single test. There is one exception for imaging data where you can do post hoc power, but it pulls data over voxels, so you have a lot of tests in that respect. A really good paper that goes into this in detail is this paper, The Abuse of Power. I highly recommend reading it. It goes through all the arguments that I've heard about post hoc power, like, oh, but I can do it this way and that's okay. It's like, well, actually, no, it's not okay. And it is in the American Statistician, but I think it's very readable, so don't be scared by that. So again, where do the effect sizes come from? Do the hypotheses match the models? Do the power estimates seem reasonable? And where are the parameters for the power analysis defined clearly? And I hope we can stop this idea of just treating power analyses as a checkbox, because then it does become a throwaway statement. And it's not going to help the replication crisis or anything like that if the thing that the calculation we're doing to help make our studies more replicable is junk, right? So you need to sit down and be honest about it. And hopefully you will be rewarded for it instead of putting in a silly one that says you have 90% power with 30 subjects. Right, and that comes down to people critically evaluating power analysis sections. So these are the links, again, because you can get these slides in the link I put earlier, and then from the slides you can get these links. So there's the link to the abuse of power paper, my power analysis tool, fMRI Power. We're going to do a demo of both fMRI Power and NeuroPower, which is Yoka Dernes's tool. I believe mine's an ROI based, and I believe hers works best with an ROI. We'll clarify that on Thursday. Or does it work best with an ROI? Oh, good. So for small effects, ROI helps. For large effects, you can go whole brain. That's pretty cool. So that will be in the Open Science Room, room 210, on Thursday from 10:30 to 11. I have a power calculation guide. I can't believe it was published in 2012. I feel like I wrote it in 2007, but there's a link for that. And if you want the code I use to make the power curves, it's the same link I had at the beginning of the talk. There's a link to a PDF with our code. So there's this quote, I'm sure you've heard it before, it's attributed to Mark Twain: there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so my goal is that on the spectrum from not good to bad, where lies are there and damn lies are there, I'm hoping that power analyses don't end up here, but that we can help push them at least closer to a little bit below lies. They're never going to be perfect, right? Because if we knew the effect sizes, we wouldn't even have to run the study in the first place. But we need to make them more useful tools than they're sometimes used to be. So that is it. So thank you.